as you're coming in to take your seats. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm trying to see how far away from the mic I can move and still be heard reasonably well. Can everyone hear me at this point in the back of the room? Wonderful. I see thumbs up. That makes me happy. My name is Joanna Taranjo. I am an attorney at Drummond Woodsum. I'm here tonight on behalf of Nordic Aquafarms to present a voluntary supplemental public information meeting regarding the MIPD's wastewater discharge license application. With us tonight and folks that will be presenting include Ed Cotter, who's the project director. Ed is sitting in the center over on that side. Then we have David Noyes, the Chief Technology Officer in the blue shirt. Carter Sear, who is the production manager at Nordic Aquafarms. They will all be presenting in general on the background regarding the project and on the nature of the discharge. Over here on this side of the room, we have Elizabeth Ransom from Ransom Consulting. She will be talking about the discharge permit parameters and the background conditions in Belfast Bay. And that we also have to her left, Nate, and your right, sorry, in the audience, Nate Dill, also from Ransom, who will be presenting some modeling regarding the discharge. Between them, I think they have around 60 years of experience in the consulting field, and the Nordic team has significant experience in wastewater technologies and fisheries. We also have with us tonight a couple of folks from the Maine Department of Environmental Protection, which is the agency that's reviewing the MIPD's application, and a gentleman from Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. They are not here to answer questions about the application. They are here to hear your input and collect information as we go through this public information process. We are here tonight to do a supplemental public information meeting. Back at the beginning of October, on October 4th, we did an initial public information meeting that's required by the department's rules regarding submission of these applications for a discharge license into Belfast Bay. After and before that meeting, we received some feedback that folks in Northport and in a wider circle would like to have a supplemental PIM, public information meeting. And the city of Belfast also indicated that it wanted an additional public information meeting after the application had been submitted. The application for the discharge license was submitted, I believe, on October 19th. And we are holding this additional public information meeting after noticing everyone that had provided or expressed interest in the application to the Department of Environmental Protection. We got their list of interested parties, and we sent, at least by email or whatever contact information was provided to the department, excuse me, we used to provide notice of this meeting tonight. We also sent notice to everyone within a 1 mile radius on the water of the intake and outfall structure. So hopefully we have a crowd here tonight that is different in some respects than the folks that were present at the meeting that we did in October. We are going to be conducting essentially a very similar public information meeting, kind of going over the project and talking about the permitting process, but we are in a different place than we were in October 4th when we did the required public information meeting. Following this application process and permitting process, this is one of many permits that will be sought for this project. This is just the wastewater discharge license. There will also be federal licensing that is done through the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for the intake and outfall structure itself, the actual kind of pipeline. There will also be a Site Location of Development Act permit and a Natural Resource Protection Act permit at the state level, as well as significant groundwater well permitting, which falls also under the NRPA, the Natural Resource Protection Act, at the state level. The DEP will require additional meetings like this for those applications, so this is by no means the last opportunity. We have agreed voluntarily to notice the larger group that we noticed for tonight's meeting. for all of those public information meetings going forward. So you will get more notices about additional meetings in the future as we develop those applications. At the City of Belfast level, there will also be several local permit applications that are submitted, and those permit applications will also include additional opportunities for public participation in the process. So tonight we are here doing a voluntary public information meeting. Like I said, the purpose of this meeting is to discuss the criteria that are applicable to the discharge permit. And the folks from Ransom will go through those in a fair amount of detail. Normally, like I said, the PIM is required before submission of the application. This is a supplemental one that is being done to provide updated information for those of you that have been to the previous PIMs. We have tried to supplement the materials that we're presenting tonight with responses to questions that were asked at the first public information, kind of the common questions. We didn't go through all of them. We did respond to those questions in writing when we submitted our application, but at this presentation, we are trying to provide additional information about areas that where numerous people had questions. So we hope there will be some new information for those of you who have attended these meetings in the past. My understanding is that the Department of Environmental Protection at this point has added the full project file for this project to their website under the significant project section, so it's available for you to view all of the materials on their website. It is also available on the City of Belfast website, and we are sending hard copies of all of our applications to the City of Belfast and the town of Northport, so you can go and view those in person as well if you wish. We have also had video being made tonight that we will ask the City of Belfast to post on their website, and they have likewise video from the October 4th meeting if folks want to take a look at that. Tonight, we are going to take approximately 1 hour for our presentation. It is being, like I said, videotaped, and we'll ask them to post it. There are 200 copies of some papers that were sitting on the chairs by the entrances when you came in that describe the DEP's public participation process. Those information sheets are intended to be provided like we did provide them at the first public information meeting, so we are a little bit further along in the process than those sheets would indicate, but we are still at the stage where the DEP is reviewing the permit. They are still receiving comments. The period for requesting board jurisdiction or a public hearing has passed, but otherwise the time periods remain open. I also indicate on this slide that sign-in sheets will be provided. Because there was no table on the by the entrances here, I did not do sign-in sheets tonight. I have in the past. If anyone wants for me to send them follow-up information, please provide me your information. If I had inadequate information when we gave you notice, please feel free to let me know that as well. I will stick around for a little bit after the meeting. So what is this permit for? In 1972, the federal government enacted the Clean Water Act, which made it illegal to discharge pollutants from a point source. That means stuff coming out of a pipe in the way that it will for this project into navigable waters unless you get a permit. And that is the permit that we are seeking from the Maine Department of Environmental Protection. In Maine, the state has been delegated the authority under the Clean Water Act to issue those permits and to review those permit applications. One of the major impacts in the city of Belfast of the Clean Water Act was to put an end to the kind of discharges that the city was seeing in the days of the chicken farms. I am going to turn it over to Mr. Cotter to talk about background on the project.
Sorry, Miss. Just before you go, it's another housekeeping thing you introduced, and I just wasn't sure. I wanted to make sure that I understand that all of the people up here, all of you are here in your professional capacities, which is to say that you're all being paid to be here. Is that true?
Certainly, I, as an attorney, am being paid to be here, as are the consultants. The folks that work for Nordic, this is part of their job.
They work for Nordic, so you guys are.
So we are going to run the PIM. We're going to take questions at the end.
Thank you for taking mine right then. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Joanna. So wanted to give a little background on the project. A lot of you have seen some of this or heard it, but there are people in the crowd that have not been as involved or talked about the project as much. So we're looking forward to bringing you up to speed and why we're here today and where we are hoping to go to. Most people, when you think of salmon, you think of wild-caught salmon or farm-raised. The farm-raised salmon industry is a very well-established industry. It has been going on for several decades. And in the recent years, there has been issues that have been found with salmon farming. There's issues with sea lice, other pathogens in the water. There's discharges that are in the bays and estuaries where the farms are located. And it wasn't really a big deal, but the fact that we are at the point where, as a population, we need to greatly expand our aquaculture and our sea farming efforts, it's getting to the point where we need to look at a more sustainable method. What Nordic Aquafarms and others around the world are doing now is bringing that process upland to a closed system, which is a sustainable and completely traceable and traceable system. Everything that goes into the system and out of the system is controlled and measured. We will take salmon from eggs and grow them to a smolt size where they will be then sorted and brought into a saltwater environment through the natural process. And at that point, we will be growing them out to full market size. The system, as I mentioned, is closed. We will be controlling the water that goes into the system. We'll be bringing in both marine and fresh water. We'll be cleaning that water on the way in, making sure that we understand what's going into the system. And then we will be discharging water back into the bay. That discharge is filtered and treated and continually monitored to make sure that we understand the constituents in that water and that they are at or below the levels that we'll be talking about today. The net result is a product that is local, fresh, and completely traceable. So why are we here in Belfast? We've talked about this quite a bit, and when Nordic Aquafarms started to discuss this project with local authorities and local consultants, there was a list of items that we need, and several of those boxes are checked off in Belfast. The primary items are clean seawater and fresh water. Cold water is preferable. It helps us reduce our power consumptions. We wanted to be in a community which was attractive for employees. We're looking to attract a lot of top quality talent from locally and around the world, and the ability to be able to draw from the local community as well as have that attractive community to draw from people around the world is a big positive for us. Finally, we're close to services and vendors, and we're also very close to our local markets. So Boston, New York, Washington, and the Maine market are all very close. We can drive the product down there and further reduce our carbon footprint that way. Now, why do we feel that this is a benefit for Belfast? We've all talked about the jobs. We expect that there will be approximately 100 people employed in this facility.
I think they said 60 or 65 last time.
That is phase one. And so we're looking at a full build-out. We expect approximately 100 jobs. We look forward to being a part of the Maine business community and bringing not only our business, but those of our ancillary suppliers that we will be bringing in and need to operate. And then additionally, we're looking to be a part of Belfast, and as part of that, we're going to be a taxpayer and a significant taxpayer to increase the revenues to the city of Belfast.
Sir, I am going to ask you to please stop calling out and wait for questions at the end, okay?
I heard you.
Thank you.
So just a little bit more about the difference between net pens and Upland Aquaculture. We are removing and reducing and recycling the nutrients from our production water. So all the nutrients we're talking about today go through a wastewater treatment facility. Those solids and the nutrients that we remove will be disposed of as solid waste, and we'll be partnering with local vendors that are interested in taking that solid waste and using it for fertilizer and other products. Sea pens do not have the ability to do this. We treat all the water coming in and out for both bacteria and other pathogens in addition to those solids. So this way we know that we're not bringing pathogens into our system that might make our fish sick, and we're also not sending any pathogens out into the water. And David will talk about that more shortly. Fish escape, we hear a lot of concerns about fish escape. We are connected to the bay only through a series of filters and pipes, and there is several barriers that would prevent any fish escape from ever occurring. So this, again, is a common issue with sea pens. It is not a concern for upland farms because of those barriers and the physical limitations that prevent any possible fish escape.
That's false.
Medications and chemicals for sea lice. As I mentioned, we filter the water coming in. Sea lice don't get a chance to get into the system, so we therefore don't have to medicate to keep them, to keep the salmon healthy. Operation on private property. There's been a lot of discussion about the property that we're on, but one thing is that it is for the production of fish and the biomass that we're providing, it is a very small footprint on private property that does not interfere with the public lands.
False.
Finally, we source healthy, non-GMO ingredients for our feed. We'll be talking about the feed shortly in more length, but again, it's a developing area where we look to really drive the market to become what we hope it can be. So at this point, I'll let Elizabeth Ransom come up, and she's going to talk to you a little bit about the permit process and the discharge.
Thank you, Ed. So the MIPD's permit regulates pollutants. And a lot of us, when we think about pollutants, we're thinking about some of the toxic substances that were originally listed in the priority pollutant list developed by EPA in 1977. So we think of things more typically such as pesticides and heavy metals. Those are toxic substances, and we regulate those so that we keep them at a very, very low concentration. But what you're going to be hearing about tonight in Nordic's discharge is not toxic substances. We're talking about non-conventional pollutants, which are also regulated by the MIPD's permit. And these include things like oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus, things that are nutrients necessary for life, but obviously at too high a concentration, these can also be harmful. So again, we're talking about discharging low levels of residual nutrients, not toxics. So some of the key discharge components that we're going to talk about tonight include total suspended solids. That's something most of us are pretty familiar with. You know, you go swimming on a day after it's rained really hard, you see a lot of stuff in the water, and that stuff might be plant matter, it might be sediments kicked up from the bottom, but things that get churned up when we have a heavy rain, that cloudiness that you see in the water is total suspended solids. You might also see have here reference to biological oxygen demand, BOD. That's a very general parameter that we can look at to look at sort of what's the general health of the water. And it's a very common thing for discharge permits to have in there so that we know at a very broad sense, is what's coming out of the pipe too much? You'll also hear us talk about nitrogen and phosphorus. These are things that we commonly see in our own runoff from our lawns, and they're pervasive in the atmosphere, but obviously too much can cause problems. And we're all familiar with seeing, an enclosed body of water in the summertime might get an algal bloom because they have too much nitrogen coming in from the surrounding camps and lawns. That would be an example of too much of a nutrient. So really important is understanding what's background levels in the bay. Obviously, you want to make sure that whatever goes into the system isn't going to cause a problem for what's there, and that can be caused by maybe a bay that's already stressed, and if you elevate it just a little bit, you're causing additional stress, or maybe you've got a very pristine body of water, and you're just simply taxing it with too much coming from your discharge. So what we wanted to first go out and understand is what's currently there in the bay. So we looked at a range of what might be available for historical studies of the bay, and there is some information about the bay as a whole, but there's nothing really specific to where we were planning to put the pipe. So we went out this summer and we did some sampling, and we collected some data for some of these key components that I've been talking about. And these are just some ranges for what we found in the bay. And I don't expect that really anyone's going to memorize this slide, but if you're interested, you can certainly see this in our permit application. And what we found was TSS was 6.9 to 11 milligrams per liter. And some people might ask, why are we using milligrams per liter? That's the language of science and applications for this kind of thing. It's not because the company is Norwegian and we're using the metric system to be hard, but that's the language we use when we're talking about chemical compounds. I'm not going to read my way through all of this, but you can see that there are detections for all of these compounds typically in the bay, and what you might expect is that things might be a little different right at the bottom of the little river where we have a little bit of fresh water coming over the dam versus what you might see further out in the bay where it's got more circulation with the salt water. I suspect that some of these numbers might change again. If I were to go up above the dam and sample the fresh water, we would expect to see even more nitrogen. So that's just a little setting the stage of what the background in the bay looks like. David's going to come up and talk to you a little bit about the treatment processes and what we do with the wastewater before it's discharged, and then I'm going to come out and talk a little bit more about what those discharge parameters mean.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out this evening. I sincerely appreciate you all braving the weather to come out and talk with us. So I'm going to discuss a little bit about our wastewater treatment facility and our wastewater treatment processes. And there's a significant difference between Nordic Aquafarms and the commitment to their environmental stewardship versus traditional salmon farming and aquaculture facilities around the world. They made a significant investment in a wastewater treatment facility on our outfall, which will prevent a high degree of nutrients from entering the bay. And so in our facility, we have actually on the grounds at full build out roughly 27 wastewater treatment plants on site. And that's because each of these systems has their own individual RAS, or recirculating aquaculture system, that treats and denitrifies the water, removes solids, strips gases, and oxygenates the water. This removes BOD, nitrogen, solids, total suspended solids, and phosphorus in that water and makes it clean enough to actually go back in for the tank for the fish to live in ideal conditions. The waste from that is then sent to its own standalone wastewater treatment facility, which then further treats the water, and it goes through two streams. And those two streams remove the solids and then clarifies and treats the water. And so we will remove the phosphorus from the water, and we will remove the total suspended solids from the water, and then we'll give it a disinfecting dose of UV prior to discharge before it goes out to the bay to make sure that no pathogens enter the bay. So the next slide that I'd like to show you is our membrane system. So these microfiltration goes through a 0.4 micron mesh to take out particles and remove total suspended solids. Now, for reference, the human eye cannot see anything smaller than 40 microns, and this is actually small enough to take out bacteria, which are typically 1 to 5 microns in size. And this is going to be delivered through Mitsubishi, a significant player in this field. And then they'll receive a 300 millijoule per cubic centimeter dose of UV light, which is powerful enough to disinfect and kill any pathogens that might remain in the water. So those solids that are removed are going to be dewatered, and they will then be held in a pumping tank, and they'll be removed to be off-site, used for either biogas or organic fertilizers or something to that effect. So this will be a byproduct stream that actually does have value, and there are local players here that are highly interested in these products. And so these solids will not be going out into the bay. They'll be quickly removed and taken off-site for reuse. So one of the key things that does go into the water, which we are very interested in, is feed. And so we recently announced a Feed 2020 initiative where we'll be actively working with the feed industry to create a better feed for our fish. So everything that's in the feed will be used by the fish, and we don't want to put anything in there that we don't want in our fish. And this is a key component that will separate us moving forward. We're not only going to use this, this model of developing a feed for the next 2 years, but continuously throughout the life cycle of the facility, because the feed is incredibly important for us. And as we further develop this, our discharge will continue to get better as we work on digestibility and the absorption of key nutrients. So each RAS system is designed to handle a specific amount of daily feed loading per day. The nutrient level expected from the feed load is based off of commercially available salmon formulations on the market today. However, we will be actively working to improve these formulations as we move forward with key partners, such as Skretting, who are here with us today. And these feeds will be CFIA, USDA, FDA, and ISO compliant. So how do we know the nitrogen discharge will be if we haven't selected this feed? As I said, we're going to use a commercially available feed, and we're going to use a modeling system based off of that commercially available feed, and those numbers will slowly get better as we move forward with our feed partners to develop a better feed. The proposed limits for the discharge is based off of that current feed, and we will not breach those numbers. Those limits are going to be set in our discharge permit, and there will be thresholds. All right, next will be followed by Carter Sear.
All right, so if you look at the our MIPD's application, and you weed through it, you'll see there's a list of chemicals in there, and that's not something that's unique to our application. Any project that has a MIPD's application or submits a MIPD's application is required to list the chemicals that you'll use that will be used at that facility. What's important to remember is that when we use these chemicals, we'll be required by law to use them according to the label, and as such, when they're used, they will react with the organic material that they're employed to react with, and effectively will be inert by the time they hit the drain. So you won't be seeing these chemicals in noticeable concentrations in the discharge. In addition to that, looking back at the wastewater treatment plant that David just described, all of the chemicals that would go down the drains would have to go through that, and will therefore be removed in that regard. A lot of those chemicals are standard cleaning chemicals. When you look at the volumes, they do look kind of large, and that's because we're required to estimate our annual average usage of those. So really, when they're being used, it's not totally indifferent, at least in that regard, to you using a cleaning chemical in your house. Let's see. Some of the chemicals that are listed on there are medications, and so it's important to note that the majority of those are basically listed there only for contingency purposes. So that's only an emergency, and it's something that we need to include to maintain animal welfare in an emergency situation, but they won't be part of our regular usage. Okay, so how can Nordic Aquafarms be sure the fish won't spread disease if you don't use antibiotics? So we've made the commitment to not use antibiotics as part of our regular processes. The way that we're basically able to limit our usages where other facilities might need to employ them is that we do employ that wastewater treatment plant that David just described. Effectively, that UV dosage that hits the water coming into the facility is designed to neutralize any bacteria that would enter the facility. Likewise, UV will also be employed with those RAS systems that David described throughout the facility, and any water entering the facility will also be hit with a UV dose. So it's hitting the UV dose on the way in, during production, and on the way out. In addition to the application of these technologies, there's also operational stuff, which consists of just general biosecurity practices, things like managing the movement of people in and out of the facility, limiting the people that come in and out of the facility, and employing things like mandates for sanitizing hands, sanitizing foot baths for people entering and leaving the facilities, and also requiring employees to use facility-specific clothing and things of that nature. All right, so next I'm going to turn it back over to Elizabeth here, who's going to talk a little bit more about how what those discharge numbers mean.
Thank you, Carter. So you'll note in our application that there basically for each of these compounds there is a stated amount in the application which Nordic anticipates for their discharge. They've through the feed calculations that David was talking about earlier, and an understanding of their treatment processes, they're able to come up with numbers that are what they anticipate they would discharge at a full build-out of 33,000 metric tons of production. So not what they would be discharging on day one, but ultimately with 33,000 metric tons of production while fully built out. And so that TSS discharge that they estimated is at 165 kilograms per day, which is the equivalent of 6.33 milligrams per liter. You may remember that background that we measured in the bay, what's there right now, is 6.9 to 11 milligrams per liter. So in the case of TSS, Nordic's discharge will actually be lower, in other words, cleaner than what's in the bay right now. That's for TSS. Actually, it is, because they're using this filtration system to clean water. So it's
No. If you're adding TSS to the water, right? You're saying that.
I'm saying that the TSS coming out the end of their pipe will be less than what we currently measured. Now, that's not. Grant you, it's not every day, but the amount of discharge will be at a lower concentration for TSS than what is measured as background right this summer.
But that doesn't mean that the residual discharge is lower. It's just not lower because it's accumulative. It's not.
TSS is the amount of suspension in the water. So there's, if you want to think of it another way, the water clarity is sometimes it's a mix of sort of turbidity and TSS, but the clarity of what they discharge, it will be more clear than what was what we measured over the course of some sampling rounds this summer. So the actual clarity of the water, if I held up two jars, you would see a more clear jar in the discharge from their pipe than what was in the bay this summer while we were sampling.
So you're suggesting that you're putting in a ginormous fish farm and the discharge is cleaner than you're saying you're cleaning up the bay with your sample.
I'd like to take that question at the end, but I am saying that for TSS, then the concentration is lower than what we measured in the bay.
It's a very misleading slide.
For BOD, the discharge is 162 kilograms per day, which is the equivalent of 5.55 milligrams per liter. The background measured near the pipe during our sampling this summer was at or near the detection limit of 2 milligrams per liter. So in this case, discharge is slightly higher than the BOD, and that
It was 3 times as much. That's not slightly more.
I think it's if you can hold that thought, we'll get to some discussion of that a little bit later. But hold on to that thought. I understand what you're saying. I think you'll see my point a little bit later. The phosphorus discharge is 5.8 kilograms per day, or a concentration of 0.2 milligrams per liter. Background was 0.12 to 0.024. So again, phosphorus is higher than what was measured in the bay. But again, phosphorus will quite quickly come to background levels. We also measured nitrogen and ammonia. These are two other parameters that are in the discharge application. Nitrogen will be discharged at a concentration of 23 milligrams per liter. Background again was measured at 0.17 to 0.48 milligrams per liter. Of that nitrogen, we look at the different components of that. Ammonia being sort of the most toxic component, typically, that you're concerned about with regard to how it interacts with the surrounding environment. The ammonia portion of that is 0.07 kilograms per day, or a concentration of 0.003 milligrams per liter. The ammonia discharge is also lower than what is currently existing in the bay today.
So is that nitrogen level that's going to be discharged, are you saying it's 50 to 135 times greater than what currently is in the bay?
Yep.
That's correct. We're going to get to that in a little bit, because I know that sounds alarming. We'll get there in a moment.
I feel like I want to drink it. I know Eric does, but I don't know.
So I'm going to turn it over. Actually, I guess I'm going to keep going here. We've had a number. Bear with me, because we are going to get to a little bit more of like, what does this really mean? Right now I'm giving you a lot of numbers, but we haven't gotten to the what does it mean. So one of the questions we've had a lot about is, well, how do you know that what you're discharging, or what you say you're going to discharge, is what you're discharging? There are protocols for measuring what goes in through that wastewater treatment plant as a process of their overall operations and quality systems. That includes a combination of sensors and manual testing throughout the facility, and maintaining a discharge log. So do we know that what we think we're doing with this wastewater treatment plant is actually what we're doing? And they need those results to document how are we doing, and are we doing, are we maintaining our systems appropriately. In addition, though, there are limits that the DEP is going to set that say this is what you have to meet, and those permits come with a requirement for sampling and testing, and those are public record. So when Nordic submits the results of those testing to the state, as they'll be required to do, those become part of a public record that you can all look at and understand how they're doing and meeting their log. If you can just...
But you will continue to discharge even if you don't meet those numbers. So if you don't meet a number and you've discharged 7 million gallons on that day out into the bay that didn't meet that number, it's still going to be in the bay. It's going to be reported in a public record, but you will have discharged. You can't let it just sit there, right?
They're not going to be allowed to discharge if they're not meeting their numbers. So
Stop that. Give me a break. Come on. Let's get real.
Let me finish presenting their information, please, before you interrupt them continuously.
Nordic is also right now working on expanding the data set of what's available for background in the bay, so that it is possible to look at what the long-term effects of the system will be. And let's also remember, the facility is being developed in stages. They're not going to have full production overnight. So if Nordic's not meeting what they think they can achieve with their treatment processes in the beginning, they're not going to get to a full build-out before correcting that. So right now, we're moving forward with an application that's for the full build-out, but there are many, many years to get to a full production. It takes roughly 2 years and slightly more to grow a salmon to full size. And so there will be many steps along the way where there'll be opportunity to make sure that Nordic is meeting the discharge protocols that it's established, and that it's meeting the limits that the state permit allows. So some of you are familiar with what goes out into the bay already, but for those who are not, you may not be aware, but obviously the state of Maine has a number of discharges up and down the coast. Most of our communities have municipal wastewater treatment facilities. There are other facilities that discharge toxics. There are also other facilities that discharge nutrients similar to what Nordic is proposing. There are a number of seafood-related businesses up and down the coast of Maine. There are other facilities in Penobscot Bay that also already hold a MIPDES permit. And I'm not just referring to other aquaculture operations, I'm referring to the fact that there are a number of both commercial and municipalities that have discharge permits. And so you might be interested to know, well, how does what Nordic's doing compare to those other facilities, and what is typical? So these are publicly available pieces of information, and all I've done is kind of pull up some numbers from similar discharge permits in the region. What you'll find is that BOD and TSS limits are typically set at about 30 milligrams per liter, although some facilities might be much higher. Some other facilities, it could be a little lower, but I think what you'll typically see is those numbers are typically set at about 30 milligrams per liter. What Nordic's proposing, though, is for those parameters, for 5.5 milligrams per liter and 6.33 milligrams per liter of TSS. The reason they're able to propose those limits is because they've been able to take advantage of some of the dramatic improvements in wastewater treatment over the past years and implement something that will result in a much cleaner discharge than some of what's currently permitted in the coast of Maine. And when you think about it, I know we all are looking at 7 million gallons of water and saying that's a real lot of water, but in reality, the whole of Penobscot Bay is something on the order of 720 trillions of gallons of water. So we have a fairly clean discharge going into a fairly large body of water, and so the resulting impacts from that are minimal. I know a lot of people in the previous meeting were asking a lot about nitrogen, because obviously when you look at it, the largest nutrient that is a component of the waste stream is nitrogen. And so one of the things that we took a look at is, well, what are the other sources of nitrogen going into Penobscot Bay right now? And there's a fairly extensive study of sort of the nitrogen loading for some of the major river systems in the eastern U.S. and looking at river systems in Virginia and Maryland as well as New England. And one of the things that was evident in Penobscot Bay is that about 11.5% of the nitrogen in the bay is from agricultural runoff. 17 to 18% comes from other development. 4.3 is from other point source discharges. So those other permits that I was just talking about ultimately give about 4.5%. And then the rest of that comes from atmospheric deposition. So right now, in the absence of Nordic's operation, that's what's going into the bay. Nordic's discharge is anticipated to add less than 1% to that point source discharge number. So I know the numbers can sound, a little hard to get your head around. And I'm hoping this is providing some background as to what's already happening in the Belfast Bay. I'm now going to have Nate Dill come up and talk a little bit about how water moves in the bay and how we expect the discharge to move.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, Elizabeth. So my problem that I was tasked with here was, now we've talked a lot about how the water is being taken from the bay, it's being used to raise fish, that water is being treated and cleaned and being put back into the bay. But the question now is, well, what happens to it after it goes back into the bay? And so that was kind of been my task, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've done to try to predict what's going to happen there. I guess just real quickly, my background is, as a coastal engineer, is in studying how water moves and how the different physical processes that go along. And so So the way that we approach a problem like this is we look at physics, right? And we've got natural physical laws that describe how fluids move. We can write those down as a bunch of mathematical equations, and we can use a computer to solve them. And so that's what we've done here. We've used a computer model called a numerical model that simulates how the water flows in the bay. It solves that problem. The tides forcing the water. It can solve the problem of how the wind forces the water, although in this case we've neglected winds to try to simplify things, but then also make them conservative. When wind blows on the water, it creates waves, it creates turbulent currents that tend to mix the water, and so we're neglecting the wind in this case. I'm going to see if this is actually an animation and if it'll. There we go. So what you're seeing here is there's a whole bunch of little arrows there that are showing the direction that water is flowing. And the blue and white colors, let's see if I can get it to go again, are showing how fast the current is. And this model actually simulates the entire of Penobscot Bay. This is kind of zoomed in on more of the northeastern portion of it. And so when we've calculated what all those currents are, we can get a sense of how things move around. And if I go on to the next slide here. One way to get a sense of how things move around in a body of water is to actually go out into the body of water and put something that's gonna drift with the water. And so we weren't able to go and put little ping pong balls all over Penobscot Bay, but what we did was we can do that in the computer. And so what this animation is showing is just a sense of broadly looking at sort of the northern part of Penobscot Bay, and oops, let's see if I can get it to go again. You can kind of pick one of these with your eye and follow it, and you can kind of see this is how, over the course of multiple tidal cycles, every time one of those balls kind of goes up and down, that's a flood tide to an ebb tide. And so we're looking at, I think, about 14 days here. And so you can kind of pick one of those little things and follow it with your eyes and see where it's going to go. And so this is a tool that gives us an idea and a way to predict how things are going to move around out in the bay. And so what we can do is we can, instead of spreading those balls out all over the bay and seeing where they go like we just did in the last slide, we can actually have it so that they get released one at a time at a rate that represents what the discharge rate is. And then what we can do is we can calculate. I'm going to pause this for a second. What we can do then we can count how many of those balls there are in a certain area, and from that we can estimate what the concentration or the dilution of that discharge water is. And so what you're going to see here, and I think I have a laser on here. It's not lighting up. But anyway, what you'll see down in the bottom here is a graph with a little red dot on it. And I know it's impossible to read what the numbers are on there, but that's showing the water level in the bay. That's actually the predicted water level at Belfast. And so there's a whole month-long record of tides there. And you can see, and you're familiar with the lunar spring tides when the tide range is large, and the neap tides when the tide range becomes small, controlled by the gravitational forces of the sun and moon kind of coming in phase and going out of phase. And so that little red dot kind of gives us an indication of what the tide's doing. And that up above here we have calculated what the nitrogen concentration would be over this time period. And I'm going to let this go. And what you'll see here is you can kind of see the concentration showing up above the background. And then it goes away because during the spring tide, the currents are stronger, they're moving a lot more, so the concentrations can't get that high. And then as you get into the neap tide again, you can see that you can start to see some nitrogen concentration going in there. And it's probably hard to read the numbers at the top there, but oops, sorry. But on the low end of the scale, the darker blue, we have basically what is the background. Okay, so that's without any discharge from Nordic Aquafarms, that's what we're looking at. And when you get up toward the higher end, we get close to that. It's a 0.5 milligram per liter value. And there has been some research that suggests a correlation between nitrogen concentrations that are higher than that value and an impact on eelgrass. And so what this is, oops, sorry. I'm going to let it play through this time. But what this is showing is it never really gets up that high, okay? And where it is in between that range is something that could conceivably be measurable, but and we'll go to the next slide, but just to give you an indication of what this looks like. And then we're kind of zoomed in on a pretty small section of Penobscot Bay here. So this is going to zoom out now and kind of give us a little bit more of a picture of it within the broader, Belfast Bay and northern Penobscot Bay, what this actually looks like. And you can see here when the neap tide, you'll see that come back again, where you can start to see some kind of a little flicker of nitrogen there. And so if you were to take that nitrogen concentration and average it over time, because one of the challenges here is that the water is always moving, and the wind is blowing it, and the weather is driving sort of this chaotic influence to what's going on here. So it's really hard to say, at one point in time go out and say, okay, this is what it is. So we've got to look at over long term, and so this is something that we can do with the computer model tool that you really can't do physically. You're not able to go out there and take samples of the water everywhere for a month, but we can do that with the model. And if we do that and we average what that nitrogen concentration is, actually the median nitrogen concentration, you get something that looks like this. And then we've got the state has identified some eelgrass areas that are near there, and you can see that the concentrations, the median concentrations, don't even come close to impacting those areas. Okay, so we talked a little bit about nitrogen, but what about some of the other constituents in the discharge? So the BOD, the TSS, anything else you can imagine. The way we look at this and the way we looked at the nitrogen, that I'm going to explain that now after we just talked about it, is by looking at dilution. And what dilution is, and you're all kind of familiar with this, is when you have your cup of coffee in the morning, and if you're unlike me and you put milk in it or something, you don't just drink it black, you put a little drop of milk in there and you can see that dilution in the cup. And now that's kind of a bad analogy, and I'm going to explain why really quickly. When you mix milk into your coffee, the milk actually looks a lot different than the coffee, and you can see it change the color. And in the same way, these animations are kind of deceiving, because we're putting something into the water, and then I'm coloring it to try to illustrate where it's going to be. But in reality, the water this proposed discharge water is not going to be something you're going to be able to see. It's not going to look any different than the water that's in the bay. In fact, it is water that just came from the bay. And so with the animation, we can show this, but that's not, you're not going to be able to just go out there and see this. And so I think that's important to understand. And so you can actually quantify dilution. And I asked this question at the last meeting. I don't know if maybe someone can answer, but how many cups are in a gallon? Oh, I did. Okay. All right. So there's 16 cups in a gallon. So there's 32 half cups. And what this scale is showing, or actually this is another little movie that shows a couple days of the tide. On the low end, this is actually showing dilution is challenging because it's not on a linear scale. So, and I think that's been something that we've kind of brought up here when you say, okay, well, that's 3 times as much. Well, 3 times as much seems like a lot, but in the context of something like a concentration, where we're dealing with exponential scales, it's not necessarily, and so it depends on where you're at. But this is basically showing a dilution in terms of a logarithm, which is, without getting into the math too much, where that's equal to 1.5, it's about a 32 dilution. And on the other end of the scale, at the higher end that we're showing here, we're getting up to about 300. And so that's the difference on one end between taking like a half cup of water and mixing it into a gallon versus taking that same half cup and mixing it into 100 gallons. So that's 10 times more water just from the point of the highest concentration or lowest dilution on here. Yep.
What I think Nate's trying to say is when you get to this darker blue at the edges, that's 300 times diluted from what it was at the start. So in other words, if you take, for example, that BOD number of 6.3, by the time you get to the edge of that blob that's shown on the screen there, you're 300 times lower than the 6.3 that was discharged initially.
And to get down to 3 times lower, it happens almost immediately outside of the pipe. And so using this information, we can look at concentrations of anything that's in there. And I think I'm going to hand it back over to Elizabeth now. Thank you all.
So we will have time for questions in just a minute. We have about 2 or 3 more slides left. Sure. So what that is intended to show, I think we weren't 100% effective, I think, with some of our previous slides at the original public information meeting in helping clarify that point, that at the edge of that animation, what you're seeing is the dilution, and therefore the concentrations are quite low. So it's not this big thing headed toward Northport. What we're in fact showing is that by the time you get out that far from the discharge point, you're at 6 divided by 300 or 23 divided by 300. Everything has been diluted quite a bit by that point. Just bear with me for a couple more slides, and then we will start taking questions. So, the bottom line is that Nordic's using proven technologies that have been around in the wastewater industry in some form for decades, but combining them in a way that is state-of-the-art for the aquaculture industry. That allows them to have a discharge that will meet or exceed all the applicable water quality standards. Their BOD at dilution of 30 is actually below a measurable limit. Like, I won't be able to go out in the field with scientific instrumentation and measure a change in that water once we get out at the edges of this plume. The TSS is already at or below the background concentrations in the water. I know we had some questions earlier about lobsters, and obviously we treasure the Maine lobster industry, and so it's important to note that their discharge is not going to have a significant impact on DO or some of the other parameters that are essential for lobster growth, and that this discharge does also meet the information we understand from DEP to be their recommendation for nitrogen discharge in the vicinity of eelgrass beds, which are some of the most significant receptors, sensitive populations in the bay for nitrogen. I'm going to let Joanna just kind of go through this last slide, and then we'll start actually taking questions from the audience.
All right, we are here until 8, so we've got just a skosh over an hour for questions. I am going to ask that everyone that wants to ask questions come and line up over here so that I can have a sense for how many folks have questions. I'm also going to ask that those folks who have been to previous meetings that have already had an opportunity to ask a significant number of questions, maybe kind of go towards the back of the line so that we can answer questions from folks that have had no chance previously to ask questions. I will, once I see how long the line is, I am going to try to do some math in my head to figure out how long I can give folks. I am also going to ask that the audience please be respectful of the folks asking questions. And it is a significant challenge for lots of folks to come up here and ask questions. I want to be able to hear them. I want to be able to get their questions and pass them on to folks so that they can have their questions answered to the best of our ability. I will try to make time for everyone to ask questions, but I am going to keep the questions to the MIPD's application and the discharge parameters and the topics that we are presenting on tonight. If necessary, I will interrupt you and terminate your time, especially if you are insulting, aggressive, rude in any way. All right? All right. Let's go for it. And I am going to try to remember that you want me to go back to, I will try to direct questions to the right person once I hear them.
My name
Yes,
is...
I'm going to also ask folks to state their name, and we do have a court reporter here, Robin Dostie. So if you could spell your name for her, that would be fantastic. We will turn the transcript of this meeting into the DEP, so it will be part of their record as well.
Can you sleek it up?
My name is Beverly Crowfoot.
You have to have it really close to make sense.
My name is Beverly Crowfoot, Crofoot. My question has to do with water movement. In the animations which you presented, it seemed to be that you were indicating surface water movement. And in the plume demonstration, the plume comes from a submerged pipe. Does that plume rise to the surface and therefore follow your hypothetical movement, or does it in fact stay closer to the bottom of the bay as it moves through the water?
That's a good question, and admittedly, we glossed over a lot of the details of that modeling. The model animation that I was showing that we use to calculate the dilution is two-dimensional depth averaged. So that means that we assume the current is the same from the top all the way to the bottom in that model.
Is that a valid assumption?
Yes, it is.
I think some of the sailors in the room would disagree.
Okay, so please let me finish. We have also, before that, we did another model. We used another model called Cormix, which does consider the three-dimensional and the buoyancy effects on the plume. And what we found with that modeling is that, yes, in fact, this plume, because the water is fresher than the ambient water that's out there, will tend to rise toward the surface. And it will, in certain cases, and we've also looked at data in the bay, the Penobscot Bay is stratified during times of the year. So you tend to have colder, saltier water on the bottom, warmer, fresher water on the top, and that changes through the seasons. And depending on how the water is stratified, the currents can be different on the bottom, different on the top. It's very complicated. It's very complex. And so what we do is we made a number of assumptions, and when we look at the Cormix modeling, which looks at that difference in density, it tells us that plume will during most seasons will rise to the surface and at least initially stay within a layer that's at the surface or near the surface. And so when we calculated the dilution, we assumed that, even though we used depth average currents, we assumed that the water from the discharge would be completely within the surface layer. So that means that we're only allowing that the calculation of concentration for the water to be within the upper 10 meters, or upper 30 feet of the water column. In many places out there, it gets deeper than that, and after a number of tidal cycles, water that was discharged and has gone back and forth numerous times, it will start to mix down into the deeper layers. And so by assuming it all stays within that upper layer, we actually calculate dilutions that we expect to be less than what you would, yes, dilutions that would be less than, or concentrations that would be higher than what you might actually observe.
It's a conservative assumption.
Yes, conservative assumption.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Aber. I have a legal question. My husband Dan and I own shorefront property in Northport, about a quarter of a mile from your proposed fish farm. And the map you submitted with your application to the Department of Environmental Protection included a map that showed that the pipe was going to go along the intertidal and littoral property lines of the Eck roads. However, your pipes also cross the intertidal and littoral zones for 6 property owners in Northport, including me. So my questions are you suggesting in your application that the Eck roads are special and have more property rights that cancel out the property rights of their neighbors? Or are you saying that the Belfast property rights supersede those of the Northport residents? And if you're not saying that, then I'd like to know what the legal justification is to run an industrial pipe over the intertidal properties of 3 Northport residents and the littoral zones of at least 6 Northport residents without their permission.
So that question is not a MIPD's question. It goes to the Bureau of Parks and Lands submerged land lease application. And to try to answer your question, even though it's not a MIPD's question, what the Bureau of Parks and Lands requires that we submit in order to obtain a lease over the submerged lands, which are held by the state, is documentation. They specify in their regulations how you calculate the upland and littoral zones. And how you do that is by drawing a baseline on the parcel that you are coming off the land from. And that is the information that we're required to submit as part of that application. And then the Bureau of Parks and Lands looks at impacts to other littoral zones as applicable, based on how they calculate those littoral zones.
So just to clarify, so you're saying that the state will notice that you're crossing over all of the Northport property? It's like the state's responsibility to notice that it's crossing Northport property? Is that what you're saying?
Well, if it was Northport property, which it wouldn't be if it was part of the submerged land lease, then yes.
Because, I mean, we've looked at it, I mean, we have a map we can give you, but it actually crosses intertidal property of several Northport land, and then the littoral zones of six Northport properties.
You never talked to anyone in Northport about this, did you?
We submitted what's required to be submitted as part of a submerged land lease application.
And we get a nitrogen balloon to go with it. Sounds like a good deal.
Hi, I'm Carol Simon. You may have covered this.
Sorry.
Hello? Oh. How's this?
Okay.
I'm Carol Simon, and you may have covered my question in your slide about the tidal movement of the waters in the bay, but it wasn't clear to me. Nordic states that they'll have about 8. Oh, the effluent will take 2 weeks to move from Belfast to the Gulf of Maine, is the estimate.
Nate, do you want to come up?
That's the first part.
Okay.
I'm doing math here. And if you're putting in 7.7 million gallons a day, all of that's going to be in the bay. After 2 weeks, there will be 2 weeks worth of effluent in the bay. And that means that would be about 108 million gallons of effluent in the bay at the same time. Will this spread will it spread from shore to shore in the bay? And does it have an odor?
The first part of your question, 2 weeks to reach the Gulf of Maine. I think that, based on what our model shows, that sounds like a fairly reasonable estimate. I do want to sort of caveat that with the modeling that we didn't include forcing from wind, which tends to move water around a lot. We had kind of an assumed average flow rate for the Penobscot River, so as the river discharge changes, that will tend to push things out faster or less fast. But I think that the general point that the Penobscot Bay is a large bay, and the distance that something moving with the tide travels on one tidal cycle is not going to go completely outside of the bay. In some smaller bays, that kind of thing can happen. So what we saw, the animations that we saw did show about a month of simulation. But what we're also showing is that the water tends to disperse. So there's, turbulence is sort of a chaotic process in the water that's caused by the wind, is caused by friction on the bottom. It's caused by, all sorts of different, the shape of the shoreline, boat traffic. That tends to cause that water to disperse. And so, over a long, long period of time, you can see that water is going to disperse. But as it disperses, it also gets diluted, so that that the amount of discharge water that is sort of dissolved or mixed with that ambient water becomes very, very small and imperceptible. And you can think about over a month how much water Nordic is going to discharge over an entire month. Sounds like a really big number, but if you looked at the amount of tidal exchange, so if I counted how much water came in on one tide versus went out on the next tide, how much water came in on on each of the tides over a month, that number would dwarf that discharge amount. And as far as the odor, to my knowledge, there will be no odor.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Scott Kelly. It's my first time, so thanks for having me. Appreciate you trying to simplify the complex. I got what I think are 3 simple questions, so if I go too long, just cut me off. One, you talked about 27 redundant treatment systems in the system. Is that due to redundancy between the different water treatment systems?
Those are individual RAS systems on the facility itself. So each system that the fish live in is its own individual recirculating aquaculture system. That is its own miniature wastewater treatment plant that removes solids, does denitrification, strips CO2, adds oxygen.
And if one fails, I'm assuming you've got backup for it, or the system itself is designed in some kind of redundancy so that it doesn't not filter?
Yes, correct. So the individual fish systems all drain to one larger wastewater treatment plant. So there are indeed layers. So there are multiple wastewater treatment plants, which is what separates Nordic from the traditional fish farming facilities that either have none because it's open net pens, or they only have their own internal RAS system and then discharge through a different type of facility than what we have, which is a very high-end, best-in-class wastewater treatment facility.
Gotcha. Thanks. Slide 20 talked about emergency discharge or usage of chemicals or antibiotics in case of something bad happening. So since that's not normal, is there going to be some kind of required reporting when that happens?
Yes.
Easy. Thanks. Third question. So you talked about on slide 31 what happens at neap tide if there's a lot of nitrogen discharged at that time when it's not such a big tide. Kind of so what? What happens if there's a lot of nitrogen discharged at once? What does that do?
Just to clarify, there's not any more nitrogen discharge at neap tide. It's just that during the neap tides, the amount of tidal flushing is less.
Right. Okay.
And so the you think about it this way: the water that's being discharged, say on a ebbing tide, is going to move out and mix with that ebbing tide, and then on the next flood tide, it comes back again. And because it's such a large bay, some of that same water, it's not all that same water. It's been mixed for a good 12 hours. Is going to come back past that point again. And so during a neap tide, that body of water is not moving as far, and so it tends to sort of build up a little bit. And then when you get into the spring tides, it smears it out more, I think is maybe a way to think about it.
So in the time of the neap tide, what can we expect to have happen or see? Anything or nothing?
I don't think you'd be able to observe anything. I think maybe if you went out and did sampling, you might be more likely to find measurable and potentially higher measurable samples at that time than you would during a spring tide.
Thanks.
Yep.
Good evening, everybody. So I'm going to ask my question.
Could you introduce yourself, sir?
Paul Bernacki. I'm going to ask my question. Since we don't have the Attorney General here, we're not going to get an official pronouncement, and all we have is Nordic's attorney. So I'll ask my question, and then they can answer or not answer as they choose fit. But the DEP has clearly stated to me that this permit and this public meeting is, in fact, about the project of the wastewater treatment and the delineation of the project, which is why a bunch of more people have been noticed, is that the project is now in Northport. The proposal for the location of a portion of the project, which is the pipeline, is now within the territory of the town of Northport. That's what the bend is all about on that chart you saw. And the project itself is the permit. The permit is about the project. It's not just about the water coming out of the end of the pipe. It's the whole thing, the sewage treatment plant, all the water, the pumps, the entire project, just like it sounds. So the first proposal for the right title and interest portion of the requirement for this permit is that they have a submerged lands lease application in place. That's been, according to Carol DeBello, complete. So this is the first, you guys know what this looks like. This is the first, it's the straight line, and it's almost entirely within Belfast. The problem with this September 27th was that it crossed Mr. Lyndon Morgan's, Dr. Lyndon Morgan's property, and then went into a littoral zone that had nothing to do with the Eckroats or Nordic's lease. I made a comment on that. It was poo-pooed by the DEP. It was poo-pooed by a whole bunch of people and pretty much ignored. Well, I kept at it, and I kept at it, and I kept at it, and now we have a new one. And this has been nicknamed the Twisted Sister by some in the room. But you see that it's an extra 1,000 feet long, and it has 2 bends in the pipe. And so this is going to take more energy to pump that water, of course. It's going to be harder to build. But the reason is because this bend actually goes down somebody's straight line littoral zone and gets out from the blue out to the actual water. So it's been confirmed that the discharge location in these 2 proposals is different. It's about 800 feet different. The DEP has not responded to me as of today as to whether the actual locations in the permit application itself and the 2 other locations all jibe together, but we'll find out about that eventually. So the problem with the new plan is that it likewise, as a Northport resident says, it crosses the beach property of unknown people. It looks like it crosses another resident who's in the room here. It appears that that would be a reasonable thing for it to do because of the sharp angle of the pipe. And so I've had an hour-long conference with the surveyor whose evidence is being used to support the location of this pipe and to support Nordic's right title and interest claim. And that survey, which would clear this whole matter up, has for the last week been refused